The evening of August 14, 1985, felt like the perfect end to a flawless summer in Eureka, a town where nothing worse than a forgotten birthday ever happened. The air hung thick and sweet with honeysuckle. When police arrived, the scene was one of almost absurd domestic tranquility. The porch light was still on, 2 tall glasses of iced tea sat cooling on the small cedar table, condensation dripping onto a magazine. Everything suggested Clara Vale was merely steps away, perhaps fetching something from the garden. Everything was perfect, except for the single unmistakable anomaly, a deep, oxidized stain on the worn oak floor just inside the back door. Clara Vale was gone. The terror of that single stain should have launched a massive, immediate manhunt. Instead, investigators found no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no shattered window, and absolutely no witnesses. Her car remained in the driveway, her purse and keys were on the counter, and her passport was in the dresser drawer. The initial classification was baffling: voluntary departure. The terrifying question wasn't who took Clara, but rather, why did the people sworn to protect her believe she had simply walked away from her entire life? The answer lay in a deception so meticulous, it turned the victim's own home into a perfect lie. For 30 years, this file sat cold, labeled by law enforcement as a tragic, self-imposed mystery. But time reveals overlooked truths. Tonight, we push past the decades of misdirection and meticulously piece together the lost hours, the overlooked neighbors, and the single, critical piece of evidence that the original detectives failed to connect. We follow the cold case team that refused to accept the original conclusion. We investigate the sophisticated construction of a disappearing act, and the shocking new theory of motive it exposed. This is the complete story of Clara Vale, and the devastating silence she left behind. Welcome back to Unseen Crime. We dedicate our time to illuminating the cases that fade into the archives, the mysteries where the truth was masked by the familiar. In this video, we unpack a disappearance that challenged every assumption about the victim and the crime scene itself. Our approach is not to focus on the sensationalism of the moment of loss, but on the unwavering dedication of those who continue to seek the truth, often decades after the initial headlines fade. Tonight, we return to the mid-1980s, a time many remember for its stability, its trust, and its quiet, predictable routines. But in the small, forgotten corners of the map, even the quietest routines can hide the greatest disruptions. This is the case of Clara Vale, who vanished from her home on Oak Street on August 14, 1985. We are not simply documenting a missing persons file, we are investigating an intentional narrative, a calculated effort to mislead authorities and the public into believing that Clara was not a victim, but an absconder. The truth, however, is woven into the details of the life she led, details that make the idea of her departure utterly impossible. We start not with the crime, but with the woman at the center of this silence. Clara Vale was 42 years old, and in every measurable way, she was rooted in Eureka. She wasn't an adventurer seeking a sudden escape, or a fugitive looking to erase a debt. Clara was a financial analyst at Eureka Savings and Loan, a respected, meticulous professional who handled the accounts for half the town's small businesses. Her job required an absolute commitment to detail and order. Friends often joked that Clara didn't just file her taxes, she alphabetized her receipts by vendor. She was dependable, reliable, and deeply involved in her community, a fixture at the annual town fair, a volunteer treasurer for the library fund. This wasn't a woman who left a life, she was a woman who built one, piece by steady piece. Her personal life was just as stable. She had been married for 15 years to Thomas Vale, a local history teacher, and their relationship was described by all who knew them as quiet and mutually supportive. They had just finalized the plans for a long-delayed remodeling of their kitchen, a detail that seems small until you consider the planning, the quotes, and the non-refundable deposits that Clara had personally handled. These were not the actions of someone planning to disappear the following week. She maintained a strict schedule: 6 a.m. coffee, 7:30 a.m. arrival at the bank, and every Wednesday night, she hosted her sister, Martha, for dinner and cards. When Martha arrived on Thursday morning, August 15th, and found the iced tea still sitting out, she knew instantly that the routine had been broken by something far darker than a spontaneous trip. Clara's commitment extended beyond her immediate family. She was the primary caregiver for her aging father, checking in on him twice a day without fail. The Thursday following her disappearance was his weekly doctor's appointment, a date Clara had scheduled months in advance and noted meticulously on her desk calendar with a large, bold red circle. To suggest that Clara would miss this appointment, to abandon her father in need, her husband without a word, and her job without notice, was to suggest a fundamental, dramatic shift in character that no one could attest to. Her life was defined by responsibility, not recklessness. Visually, Clara was also unmistakable in town. She had a striking, kind face, known for her sharp but gentle intelligence. When her face began appearing on missing persons posters, a black and white portrait of her smiling, taken at a work picnic just months before, the community reacted with disbelief, not suspicion. They knew the woman on the poster. They knew she had nowhere else to go. Her financial life showed no secret accounts, no large withdrawals, and no pre-purchased tickets to anywhere. Everything she owned, everything she had planned, was left behind in the home she never intended to leave. The meticulous way she lived her life inadvertently became the greatest source of confusion for the police. The neatness of the house, the presence of her personal belongings, and the complete lack of visible chaos allowed officers to cling to the easiest theory, that she packed a small bag and walked away from her commitments. This focus on the superficial order of the scene blinded them to the unsettling truth of the single stain on the floor. The stain that indicated, with cold finality, that Clara Vale's control over her own life had ended precisely at 7:45 p.m. on August 14th. This is the timeline we will now reconstruct. The last known person to speak to Clara Vale was her husband, Thomas. At 7:30 p.m., Thomas, a high school history teacher, called home from a late-running school board meeting downtown. Clara confirmed she was preparing the house for their usual quiet evening. They discussed the remodeling plans. Thomas joked about the cost of the custom tiling, and Clara, ever the accountant, assured him it was budgeted perfectly. It was a mundane, forgettable conversation, the kind you have 1,000 times, until it becomes the last one. Thomas arrived home around 9:15 p.m. The house was exactly as it should have been, quiet, dark, and locked from the inside. He assumed Clara had gone to bed early, perhaps tired from a long day at the bank. It wasn't until he went to the kitchen for a glass of water that he noticed the small deviations from their routine. The back door, which was always double-locked, was merely closed, the deadbolt left unsecured. The 2 glasses of iced tea, which Clara had mentioned preparing, were still sweating on the porch table. And when he called her name, the silence that answered was not the quiet of sleep, but the sudden, terrifying vacuum of an empty house. He called the police at 9:38 p.m. When the first uniformed officers arrived, they were immediately faced with the unsettling order, a phenomenon that plagues investigations where the scene appears staged to contradict foul play. There was no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle near the entry points, no jewelry missing, and no drawers pulled out. To the responding officers, the scene screamed, packed a suitcase and left. The stain on the oak floor, the only physical violence present, was small and localized. It was easily interpreted by inexperienced eyes as a minor injury, quickly cleaned, sustained during an accidental fall. The officers noted the stain, photographed it almost as an afterthought, and primarily focused their inquiry on Thomas Vale. The golden hours of the investigation, the critical first 48 hours where leads are fresh and evidence is abundant, were fundamentally lost to this voluntary departure theory. Police protocol dictated that the partner was the first suspect, and Thomas Vale immediately became the focus. His quiet, professorial demeanor and meticulous nature were interpreted not as signs of stability, but as potential indicators of careful planning. Thomas's alibi was scrutinized. He was at a school board meeting with 10 other adults present. He had signed in, participated in debates, and was seen leaving exactly at 9 p.m. Yet, for the first 3 days, the detectives applied pressure, searching the Vale property, interviewing his colleagues, and looking for any crack in his narrative. This intense focus on the husband was standard procedure, but in Clara's case, it was a paralyzing detour. The small police force consumed vital time and resources proving Thomas's innocence, simply because the scene provided no alternative path. This is a critical failure in cold cases. When evidence is subtle, investigators often default to the easiest, most psychologically satisfying suspect, the spouse, even if the facts don't logically align. Thomas Vale endured hours of questioning, his grief compounded by suspicion, before forensic analysis finally delivered the first concrete finding. The blood on the floor was indeed human, but the volume was too small to suggest immediate lethality, which only reinforced the theory that Clara had been hurt, maybe panicked, and fled. The narrative shifted. If Thomas didn't harm her, she must have run away to escape him. But Thomas was cleared. The search had to expand, but the damage was done. 3 days had passed, and any trail outside the home was cold. The police were forced to finally treat the house as a crime scene, not a domestic dispute. The subsequent deep search revealed 3 pieces of highly contradictory evidence. First, a tiny folded note was found tucked into Clara's recipe box. It wasn't a suicide note or a goodbye, but a single sentence: "The audit will proceed on Friday, no changes." This was a work detail, seemingly irrelevant, yet it was hidden in a personal space. Second, her favorite pearl necklace was missing, an item she almost never took off, even at home. This suggested either a robbery, which contradicted the lack of forced entry, or a quick, forced removal. Third, a trace of a cryptic phone call was found. It was a hang-up call made to the Vale landline at 7:42 p.m., just 3 minutes before Thomas called. The number was unlisted and untraceable to any local source. The police interpretation of this evidence immediately led them down a significant red herring, a theory that Clara was abducted by a drifter or opportunistic robber who panicked after injuring her. The missing pearl necklace fueled this idea, and the untraceable hang-up call was dismissed as a wrong number. For weeks, helicopters scoured the nearby highway routes, and detectives focused on transient populations passing through the county. They were looking for a random act of violence, ignoring the organized, intentional nature of the scene. The audit note in the recipe box was collected as general personal effects, its professional context entirely overlooked. It was the epitome of looking for a simple, quick answer in a complicated, calculated situation. Meanwhile, Clara's sister, Martha, and her husband, Thomas, were fighting a desperate battle against official skepticism. They organized volunteer search parties, duplicating police efforts, but without the authority or resources. Martha, who knew Clara best, was the family's vocal advocate. She argued repeatedly that the kitchen renovation plans, the fully stocked freezer, the scheduled doctor's appointment, and the meticulous financial records all proved she was planning for a future, not an escape. Every televised plea, every community meeting, was aimed at countering the narrative that her sister was simply a runaway wife. The media coverage was a double-edged sword. While it kept Clara's face in the public eye, it often sensationalized the runaway wife angle, selling papers with headlines that hinted at financial secrets or a hidden lover. This coverage hurt the family deeply and inadvertently helped the perpetrator. It created a collective public shrug that allowed the case to settle into the background. The community, swayed by the lack of dramatic evidence and the police's early pronouncements, stopped looking. The shift in focus to the community perspective highlights the ethical core of this case. The system failed Clara by prioritizing an easy assumption over a difficult investigation. It took the arrival of a state police cold case consultant, brought in 3 weeks later under community pressure, to force a change in classification. The consultant recognized the sophistication of the misleading scene, stating, "When everything looks too clean, that's your first sign that someone cleaned it." Based on the physical evidence, the blood trace, the missing necklace, and the profound disruption of Clara's highly ordered life, the case was finally, officially categorized as an unlikely homicide. The drifter theory was tossed out, and Thomas Vale was completely exonerated. The consultant's report concluded, Clara had been taken by someone she knew and likely trusted. But the consultant's breakthrough wasn't the final key, it only reframed the question. The truth about Clara's final hour wasn't hidden in the woods or in a travel agency booking. It was hidden in the modern technology of the mid-80s, in a system they barely understood. It was hiding in plain sight, in a single cryptic digital message received moments before she vanished. A message the original police force, focused on paper trails and physical evidence, dismissed entirely as insignificant electronic noise. They logged it as spam. We will now follow the path of that message, a path that leads away from Oak Street and straight into the highest levels of the Eureka Savings and Loan. The reclassification of Clara's disappearance as an unlikely homicide in late 1985 gave the family a small, temporary victory. But without a body, without a confirmed witness, and with every lead pointing to an impossible phantom, the initial energy waned. Weeks bled into months, and months into years. The Eureka Police Department exhausted their few resources following the red herring, the theory of the opportunistic robber, to its inevitable dead end. The case officially went cold. The files were boxed and relegated to the basement archive, joining thousands of other unsolved mysteries across the country. The struggle for Thomas and Martha became a solitary, exhausting vigil. They became amateur detectives, tracking down every strange car, every rumor, and every late-night call, only to face the crushing reality that the trail was completely gone. The emotional toll was immense. Thomas, unable to bear the silence of the house, eventually moved in with Martha, carrying his grief like a heavy, invisible burden. The hardest thing to fight in a cold case is not the perpetrator, but the sheer weight of time and forgetting. It's a strange thing, a cold case. It's a constant argument against entropy, the physical law that everything breaks down, degrades, and fades. In these boxes of paper, we see the degradation of hope. But what investigators have learned in the decades since Clara vanished is that time can also be an ally. Technology, while imperfect in 1985, evolves, and the microscopic details that were once dismissible electronic noise can become the single, defining clue years later. This is the ultimate fight. Science versus silence. Fast forward 10 years, 1995. A small, specialized team from the state's newly formed Cold Case Division decided to pull Clara's file, looking not for new physical evidence, but for digital evidence. The original police had collected Clara's work records and her primitive personal computing data, but much of it was left unexamined. The key item they revisited was the logged phone activity on the night of the disappearance, specifically that one untraceable, 3-second hang-up call. The original department had dismissed it as spam, because the number didn't fit the local exchange. But now, with new tools for cell tower mapping and the early precursors of digital forensics, the team found something new. The hang-up call, which lasted less than 5 seconds, didn't come from a landline outside the area. It came from a pager, a device ubiquitous in the 80s, primarily used by businesses, and it was activated from a call box exactly 3 blocks from Eureka Savings and Loan, Clara's workplace. This simple discovery immediately threw out the drifter theory and threw the investigation squarely back into her highly ordered professional life. The audit note, found in her recipe box, "The audit will proceed on Friday, no changes," now took on urgent significance. This led investigators to the second suspect, Arthur Vance, the vice president of operations at the Savings and Loan. Vance, 50, was outwardly impeccable, a pillar of the community, a friend of the chief of police, and Clara's direct professional superior. But the team quickly established a hidden motive: financial desperation. Clara, as the meticulous financial analyst, had been conducting an internal audit that week. The investigators realized the note wasn't a reminder to herself. It was likely a warning, a note she meant to leave for Thomas in case she couldn't complete the task. Vance was secretly engaged in a complex, sophisticated scheme of internal theft, leveraging his position to drain funds from inactive accounts. Clara's Friday audit was scheduled to expose him. The timeline now slotted into place. Vance knew Clara would be working late. He likely used the page, a discreet, non-verbal signal, to lure her to the back entrance of the house, pretending to need an urgent, private meeting about the audit. This explains the missing pearl necklace. Clara had likely gone to the door quickly, without her purse or keys, but possibly paused to put on her signature necklace as a sign of professionalism before a serious work discussion. It was a detail the original team missed. The necklace wasn't stolen, it was the last personal object she touched before she left. The police focused on Arthur Vance, finding that his meticulous financial records, much like Clara's, were a deliberate, high-stakes camouflage. They had their probable suspect, a motive of extreme self-preservation, and a refined timeline. But they still didn't have Clara. As they prepared the arrest, the cold case team made one last, crucial discovery about Arthur Vance's past, a dark chapter from his early 20s, long suppressed and forgotten. The chilling secret Arthur Vance was hiding wasn't about where he buried the body, but what he had done with his own life 25 years before the crime. It revealed not just a panicked vice president, but a deeply ingrained pattern of violence that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The arrest of Arthur Vance in 1995 sent shockwaves through the insulated community of Eureka. The impeccable bank vice president, the man who handled the town's money and chaired the church building fund, was now charged with the murder and disappearance of Clara Vale. Vance refused to confess, forcing the prosecution to proceed with one of the most challenging legal battles, a no-body homicide trial. Their case relied entirely on the meticulous reconstruction performed by the cold case team, focusing on the evidence that connected the professional motive to the personal act of violence. The prosecution argued that the crime was not a random outburst, but a surgical act of self-preservation. They presented the pager record, placing Vance 3 blocks from Clara's house. They showed the jury the audit note, proving Clara was prepared to expose him the very next day. Crucially, they introduced the prior hidden history, the secret Vance had concealed for 25 years, a conviction for felony assault stemming from a violent argument over financial disputes in his early career. This established a decades-long pattern of escalating violence when his financial stability was threatened. The jury saw that the seemingly perfect scene at Oak Street wasn't the work of a panicked amateur, but a calculating mind attempting to erase a second crime. After weeks of testimony, Arthur Vance was convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction was a landmark moment, providing legal closure, but the tragic revelation of why and how was still necessary for the family to process their grief. It was deduced that Vance, upon realizing Clara would not be dissuaded from her audit, had met her at the door, likely feigning urgency. He struck her quickly and decisively, explaining the small amount of blood found and the lack of a struggle. The calculated part was the staging. Vance left the iced tea, left the doors unlocked, and left her keys and purse inside, all deliberate choices designed to support the theory that Clara had either run away or been taken by a random thief. This reveals the core tragedy. Clara was not taken by a terrifying stranger. She was erased by the failure of the institution she served and the greed of a man she trusted. The police missed it because they were looking for a dramatic confrontation, when the truth was a quick, cold act of violence designed to hide an economic crime. Vance had gambled that a missing person case would be easier to endure than an embezzlement charge. 4 years, he was right. His calculated nature was the key to his freedom and the key to his ultimate capture, proving that no degree of planning can truly erase a life. Arthur Vance was sentenced to life in prison. Despite his conviction, Vance continued to refuse to reveal the location of Clara's body. To this day, the Vale family continues their search, their commitment unshakable. While the final act of violence remains physically unresolved, the legal pursuit of justice brought an end to the debilitating uncertainty. Thomas and Martha, now older, still attend every parole hearing, keeping Clara's memory active. Clara Vale's legacy is not defined by her disappearance, but by the fact that her dedication to truth, manifested in her precise accounting, was the very thing that eventually led to the downfall of her killer, a decade later. The disappearance of Clara Vale is a stark reminder of the danger that hides in plain sight, not on dark streets, but in the calculated spaces of professional trust. The core lesson here isn't the brutality of the crime, but the perseverance of the cold case unit that refused to accept the initial assumption of a voluntary departure. It shows us that every overlooked detail, the subtle bloodstain, the forgotten pager call, the simple work note, is a breadcrumb left behind by a mind that was attempting to manipulate the narrative. This case was solved because a handful of dedicated professionals realized that when a crime scene is too clean, the perpetrator's intent wasn't just to commit a crime, but to stage a reality. And the ongoing cost of that calculated act is that a loving family still doesn't have a place to say goodbye. The pursuit of truth, however, finally gave them justice, honoring the integrity Clara Vale lived her life by. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on this incredible investigative struggle. What do you find to be the most unsettling aspect of Clara's case? Is it the calculated motive, that Arthur Vance risked a life sentence just to cover up a financial audit? Or is it the 30 years it took for investigators to realize the initial walked away theory was fundamentally wrong? Let me know your perspective in the comments below. If you value deep dive, ethically researched true crime stories like this one, please do us a huge favor. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next case breakdown. And if you're ready to watch another story of justice overcoming calculated deceit, click on the screen now to watch our dive into the linked case of the unsolved bank heist of 1986. Thanks for watching.